Good evening, everybody in the US, and good morning to everybody who's joining us from Australia. My name's Charlie Grant, and I'm a board member of the American Australia Association, and I also chair the association's New England Committee. I'd like to start this webinar with an acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of Boston and Cape Cod in Massachusetts and Juroa in New South Wales, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water, and community. So I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging of the Massachusetts and Wampanoag tribes and the Wadi Wadi people. The American Australia Association is delighted to host this conversation between two leading Australian educators, Adam Lewis and Leonie Degenhardt. The association was founded in 1948 and since then has provided an important forum for cooperation and exchange between leaders, from US presidents and Australian prime ministers to leaders in sport, industry, culture, and education. And today's conversation continues this dialogue. This webinar is part of an ongoing series of weekly webinars that support the association's mission of strengthening cooperation and understanding between the United States and Australia. And I invite you to visit our website and Facebook page for recordings of recent webinars and details of upcoming programs, which I hope you'll also join. The association is also dedicated to supporting the next generation of leaders, and we do this through our scholarship and awards programs. Across our education, arts, and veteran scholarships, we've invested over $12 million since 2002. So if you're interested in supporting or applying for a scholarship, I invite you to find out more on the website. So tonight it's my pleasure to introduce our guests who are going to discuss the issues around reopening schools in the time of COVID. Adam Lewis is the principal of Boston College High School. It's an all-boys Jesuit high school for about 1,500 students from grades 7 through 12. And the school's located in Dorchester, which is close to downtown Boston. Prior to BC High, Adam served as principal of Loyola School in Manhattan, and prior to that, he held senior positions at Xavier College in Melbourne, St Ignatius College, Riverview in Sydney, Clongowes Wood College in Ireland, and at Sacred Heart Catholic Secondary School in London. Adam completed his undergraduate studies at the Australian National University and his postgraduate studies at the University of Canberra and at Boston College. He's married to Aideen, and they have, I can attest, 3 wonderful children, and they live in Boston. So thank you, Adam, for joining us.
Thanks, Charlie.
Dr. Leonie Degenhardt is the principal of Degenhardt Consulting, and she's also the Emeritus Dean of the AIS Leadership Centre. Prior to founding Degenhardt Consulting, Leonie had a distinguished career in education that was wide and varied. She's taught in government, independent, and Catholic schools in rural, suburban, and inner city locations. And she's held regional and head office positions in the Catholic Education Office. Most recently, she was the first lay principal at Loretto Normanhurst, a long-established day and boarding school for girls in Sydney's Upper North Shore area. And she's worked with and lectured at Sydney University, the University of New South Wales, and at ANU. Leonie did her undergraduate studies at Monash University, and she has a PhD from Australian Catholic University. She's a fellow of the Australian College of Educators, a national fellow of the Australian Council for Education Leaders, and earlier this year, Leonie was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for her work in education. She's now semi-retired and lives with her husband in beautiful Juroa on the New South Wales coast. So please welcome Adam Lewis and Dr. Leonie Degenhardt. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie, and welcome, Adam. It's so good to see you again.
So good to see you again.
We're joined today by many people across both America and Australia, and thank you to those who have submitted questions, which have informed the direction of today's discussion. So, Adam, a lot has changed in your life and in the world since we first met in 2014 in Sydney. And I understand that your school's been open for about a week after being closed since March. What's it been like?
Oh, Leonie, it's wonderful to have the boys back in the building. As Charlie said, we're a school of 1,400 boys, and they've been off-site since March. And so the first thing to say is it's just wonderful to have them back in the building. There's a lot of work that went into it. It's strange We opened under a hybrid model. So it means that half the boys are in the building any given day. So we're working off a week A and week B schedule. 700 boys are in for the first week, and then it swaps over, the other 700 come in for the second week. So they call that a hybrid model. That's what we had to do to be compliant. We were always really committed to getting the boys back in the building. But there was really strict guidelines from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education here in Massachusetts and the Department of Public Health. So we kind of started saying, well, let's start with 1,400 and see how many we can get back in the building. And so we've started on as I said, that hybrid model. It's so far, it's challenging, to be honest. The boys are wonderful. We've got an outstanding set of teachers here and outstanding faculty, but we also had to overhaul the school physically, and that included the classrooms. We were committed to the boys learning synchronously. One of the things we learned from March was it's very difficult to do remote learning. We try not to use that language. We use the language connected learning, but it's very difficult when the boys are off site. So we were committed to them being able to call in from home and engage synchronously with the boys in the building. So there was a huge technology overhaul to do that, and the teachers are just getting used to using that now. So there's a few teething issues, but overall it's been really wonderful to have them back. We prioritized, we had two very clear priorities around our educational program. The first one was that relationships and connection have to be sustained, maintained at all costs. And the second piece is ensure continuity of learning, and that our learning is a true formation of the head, heart, and hands, which is what we speak about here. So I don't believe you can have two without one. The relationships and connections are the most important piece. And I'm pleased to say that so far, so good. As recently as last night, I can say we've had our first COVID case in the building with one of our students. So that's been a very good test of our protocols. That naturally has created some uncertainty today, and it's been unsettling, but I think we've managed it pretty well. And we knew it would happen. We're only 5 days in with our first case, but working through that's going to be a challenge. The whole, I've said this previously, in a time of a pandemic, any schools are emotional places because they're about relationships. And so, in a pandemic, those emotions are really amped up. And I feel at times I'm more of a manager of emotions or a series of emotions than a leader of a community. So just managing those emotions, being as open as we can and supportive as we can. But look, it's just wonderful to have them back in the building.
Mm. And I remember you saying in a previous discussion that you have to scrap for every relationship. And I guess that's what stayed with me. That's a real emphasis on relationships that you have. And it's certainly mental health issues have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and particularly among young people. And I understand that you recently lost a student to suicide. That must have been so distressing.
Yeah, it's actually hard to speak about, as you can imagine. This was in February, sort of immediately preceding a time when we became a community in dispersion because of COVID. And then, as well as I do, it's the hardest thing that a school community has to deal with, a loss of one of their students. And we experienced that in February. In fact, when I reflect back on the year, this was my first year at BC High, and we navigated a pandemic. We are still managing a lot of the racial tension that was brought about with the murder of George Floyd, which is so raw in the broader society, but particularly in our own community, where our students of colour have been so impacted emotionally by that. And so it's been a time of great challenge and difficulty. But when I reflect on the year, not to diminish those other things, the loss of a student is certainly the hardest thing we've had to cope with this year. And yes, it's been exacerbated by racial tensions in our society and the pandemic. But in any given year, with all things equal, that's the hardest thing. So that's been an extraordinarily difficult experience. And what's been really hard, Lenny, is what I'm discovering is that now our boys are back in the building. They weren't actually afforded the time to grieve with us collectively. We weren't able to grieve collectively, if that makes sense. So, you know, we dispersed, and then as our seniors are coming back, and they were the group particularly impacted because it was in their grade level, like they haven't processed it or shared it as part of our community. And so that's something we anticipated, but I didn't quite anticipate the extent of it. So working through that with our boys is going to be a challenge. But I mean, look, beyond that, the mental health of our boys and our adults, but particularly our boys, is the most important thing. I mean, I don't want to get too philosophical, but some people disagree when I say, I don't think it's ever been harder to be a young person, Lenny. You know, they're the most connected, the most concurrently connected and disconnected generation. So they have access to all the information, yet that actually affords them a way where they have relationships that are actually disconnected because they can happen on a screen. And we talk about depth of relationship. And I think that the world is increasingly superficial, secular. You know, Pope Francis talks about the globalization of indifference, right? That's hard language to hear, but I understand what he's saying there. And so as a young person, it's never been harder to discern what's real, right? In our place, we talk about understanding what's in your heart. And I think there's so much noise around our young people. And then you combine that with just the ordinary pressures of college and academic expectations, and throw in a pandemic, and our young people are particularly vulnerable. And I also work with boys, and our young men are particularly sensitive, even though they don't look it all the time. And they naturally internalize. So that's the bit that keeps me up at night in terms of how our boys are coping with that, what they're internalizing, how they're processing it, how they're making sense of it. So you're absolutely spot on. It's our hugest challenge, I think. You know, it's such a difficult thing to navigate.
Oh, thank you, Adam. I got a sense of what it was like in listening to you. So leading a school is a pretty challenging thing to do at even the best of times. So why do you do what you do?
Because of that, because of the challenge. You know, I see it as a real blessing, Lenny. You get an opportunity, I guess, to lead and shape a community, to influence it. And it's a community based on relationships. So I've always been fascinated by stories and context, you know, and as a Jesuit school, our starting point of our Ignatian pedagogy, as you know, Lenny, is context, right? And I love the fact that in our community, or in any school of community, you have a range of contexts and a range of stories. And before any learning happens, the responsibility is to gain a deep understanding of those stories and those contexts, so you can truly accompany, in our case, our boys. And so I like that. I like the challenge that goes with that. I like getting to know stories. And good schools are values-based. They're inside out. So they talk about something deeper. We've got a clearly articulated mission, which speaks to a deeper purpose of our boys' education, or as I say, our boys' formation. And if you get an alignment of the heart, so if what I value is what the school values, or what I hope and dream for our young men is what their parents hope and dream for them, it can be really powerful. And I think if you walk into a building every day and your heart's aligned, it's a real privilege. It's a blessing, actually, you know, like it's a real privilege to do that. And if you're then in a position to lead it and work with wonderful people, like my leadership team, an extraordinary group of people who inspire every day, I'm not convinced it gets much better. So yeah, I mean, there's challenges that go with it, but you're also you're in our case forming men into good people, and that's a wonderful opportunity.
That's why I often say that principalship is the best job in the world, but it comes with its challenges, certainly.
Oh, for sure.
For sure. There's a good understanding of that. But Adam, for decades, scholars have been documenting what they call the ever widening tear in the social fabric. And noted, these same scholars, that schools are often seen as a means of mending this tear in the social fabric. Has this been your experience?
Yes. Yeah, and I would say increasingly so. You know, I think that in our place, we're a Catholic school, and so I feel sometimes we're more than a school, we're almost a parish and a neighborhood, or whatever you want to call it, in itself. And I'm finding that certainly in our school, we're becoming increasingly countercultural as well, Leanie. So, you know, when you walk in here, we talk about, you know, depth of relationship, you know, genuine accompaniment. And I think the world outside is, you know, as I've said before, it's increasingly superficial, and there's this expectation that we'll almost bring the meaning into the lives of the kids. And I think that you know, families do that, but when they come here, and I think a big reason why our parents send our kids to us is for that deeper purpose. And it's more than just the head, it's the heart piece of the formation, right? And I feel that pressure acutely, because as I've said to you before, we're in the business of forming good men, but we also talk about a concept of relationship that's actually completely shifted. So when I talk about relationship here, for our boys, their relationship is on a screen most of the time. Yet we talk about engaging in reflective dialogue. You know, be discerning, take the time to be still. And I'm not sure that outside the school, they get a lot of time for that. And so, Lenny, I think yes, and more so now than ever. I even think about, as I said before, the sense of racial tension now in this country, but particularly in our community, and the really rich work we have to do there now, engaging our boys in that conversation. And that's really difficult and really challenging, but it's the most important work in a way, you know?
Mm-hmm. I often think it's we're on the horns of a dilemma, really, in running schools. On the one hand, being blamed for standards not being sufficiently high, and on the other hand, expected to actually fix much wider social and economic problems. It's a bit of a challenge to juggle all of that, but thank you for your insights.
No, and Leanie, the other thing is, I mean, our current context is one of really serious dislocation and disconnection. You know, yeah. I mean, the one thing that's really struck me this week is the number of boys who've actually thanked us as administrators for getting them back in the building.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, and boys, they're not always forthcoming with praise, or, you know, but they are very clearly, you know, happy to be here, and they're happy to be reconnected. And I think it's a big piece of it that you speak of. But there's that tension. I mean, Lenny, you would have felt that more, because then we have some parents saying, well, listen, get the academic piece done, right? Engaging in the conversation around social justice or around those other broader issues aren't going to lead to the better GPA or the better SAT, and hence the better college. And I think that's a tension that always exists. I'm sure you felt it at Loretto Normanhurst. I watched Shane Hogan navigate it at Review when I learned so much from him about that. But it's about being clear who you are, what you prioritize, and that piece of, it's more than just an education of the head. Like, it's a formation of the head, heart, hands, and you have to have those conversations in order to do that.
Exactly. And as you know, I'm still in touch with a number of schools and school principals. And what I'm hearing is similar stories, that the kids are coming back. And while we both know that adolescents can be somewhat challenging, but they're just most wonderfully frank people, yes. But they are coming back with an attitude of gratitude to the schools, to their teachers. And that's somewhat unusual, because oftentimes in schools, kids take a lot of stuff for granted. So it's interesting that there are parallels across our two countries.
Yeah, for sure.
As well as being a school principal, Adam, I mean, you're a human being. You're a husband, a father, a son. How have you managed on a personal level with all that you're dealing with? What sustains you?
it's been very difficult to manage, Lenny, to be frank. I think I shared this with our colleagues here at BC High. I said that I've never spent more time with my family, yet I don't think I've ever felt less present to them. And I know that sounds strange, and I'm talking more than the physical presence, as you can understand. It's almost like the days have been unrelenting. So while I'm in the space at home, I'm constantly thinking about what's happening in the school. And likewise, when I'm in school, because the kids are downstairs, it's hard to be present there. So I've found that piece very difficult, because leadership, as you know, is about being authentically present to people. And that's been very difficult to navigate. I think the other big piece for me is that leading with such uncertainty. So you want to give a sense of being confident and in control in terms of emotionally, to inspire confidence in others. Yet we've been coming back, as we've been preparing for the school year, coming back, the guidelines goalpost shifted almost daily. So, you know, as I'm trying to say to people, it's safe to come back, it's good to come back, things are shifting. So to reconcile that, you know, to try and project confidently when internally you don't feel confident is very, very difficult. And I'm a deeply reflective person. And so I've always relied on being able to go in and look at myself really critically in order to be able to lead effectively. But that's not so easy when you go in and you don't necessarily like what you see. And by that, I mean, you don't have all the answers. You're actually really uncertain yourself. The weight of safety of the community, like, we're bringing these kids back. What if someone gets really ill? Like I'm saying to our teachers, you have to come back. They've got kids at home. They have to come back in the building with all their uncertainty and trepidation. And it's easy not to go in and really examine that, you know, but you have to do it in order to lead. So reconciling that, I have found extraordinarily difficult. I mean, I get great solace from my family and most comfort from them. But it's also been very difficult just to be really present and reflective. And I'd say that's probably been the most difficult part for me. Remember, we only moved here in September. So in any move, significant move, there's always that settling in period anyway. And so the kids settling in school, us settling into a town we admittedly know and love from when we first lived here, but put that in the mix has been very difficult. So I think at a personal level, I've really wrestled with my leadership over this time. You know, it was never going to be easy. It's been more difficult than I could have ever anticipated. So, you know, that's where I am on it. You know, I remember, Lenny, you sent when I did the flagship course with you in 2014, one of the readings you gave us was from Peter Senge about leadership is as much about becoming a human being, right? I don't think I've ever felt that more than during this period.
Very challenging. And I guess how you've just described that reality, that internal reality, is another example of how authentic you are as a leader. It's, are you able to make time for yourself, you know, to sort of carve out a bit where you can be as naturally reflective as you want?
Not really. And I think that's on me as much as anything else, actually. You know, I can carve out time. I haven't been as intentional as I need to be with that. Part of it is just there's so much in front of me, as with everyone in this day and time. But if I'm being honest, I often use that as an excuse, Lenny. You know, when I carve out the time and make time for it, I know the value of it. But as I said, it's not that easy, because when you do go into that deeply reflective space, there is so much to navigate there. I know you need to get into it, but it's more comfortable not to go into it, if that makes sense. And I don't mean that as a cop-out. I do it, but I have found it really difficult. And the big piece is that this isn't, you know, a big challenge personally is really, you have to draw people with you on this. This can't be something that's imposed. It's, you know, we opened school, we did so much work in the summer, but, you know, my team didn't have a summer. And together, and in terms of our leadership, we had to believe that we were doing this for the right reasons. Like we were committed to get, the easy thing would have said, we're staying remote, right? That would have been the comfortable and easy thing to do. But I don't believe for a second that would have been the right thing to do for our boys.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, Adam, that you need to bring people with you. So these are such complex communities here with many stakeholder groups. You've got students, teachers, parents and caregivers, trustees, extended families, local businesses and communities, and you're juggling state and national offices, and this is just for a start. So how do you balance the competing demands of so many groups?
Again, it's a very difficult thing to do. I think that I always find the best way to do that is to be really unambiguous in terms of who we are, why we are, our mission, the centrality of our students, and be completely unambiguous that with all stakeholders. So whether it's working closely with our president, Grace Cotter-Regan, and other members of the board of trustees, whether it's communication with families, whether it's when we're applying for government funding or whatever it may be, we're just unambiguous in terms of who we are, why we exist. And it's also, it comes about, as you know, from just a deep level of trust and faith in that commitment to mission. It's about, I think, also people understanding their role as part of it. So for example, our advancement team this year, one of the things we experienced was our families were really like hit economically through the pandemic. Our families, in many cases, people lost jobs. So our advancement team did a wonderful job in terms of rallying emergency funds, you know, but it was towards that deeper purpose. And so clarity over that and where people can contribute and an understanding of roles in that, I think is particularly important, because I think some of the tension happens when there's going to be a natural intersectionality around those roles, but sometimes it can be unhelpful if it becomes territorial, you know, and I think that, I'm sure you've had that experience in schools. And I think when you get into that space, it can have a really negative impact. So I think it's about being clear on where you start. And in our case, it's our mission and our boys, and then everything working out from that. And whether you're a member of the board of trustees, whether you're a parent, whether you're a faculty or staff member, there's absolutely no uncertainty in terms of why we exist. And I find that it's never smooth sailing, but if you can come back to that, that's when I feel it works most effectively.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Just yesterday, I was listening to another American Australian Association webinar by Nick Stone, the founder of Bluestone Lane. Yeah. And I was struck by the degree of alignment, as I see it, between what schools are trying to manage and also what you're trying to manage in running a business, you know, with many, many outlets. And it's the bringing the people with you, it's the focusing on the client's experience, and also Nick was talking about having to manage social media, which allows anyone with a high degree of anonymity to say whatever they like without necessarily taking responsibility for it. How do you manage all of that sort of area?
With great difficulty, Leni. And I think that, I'll give you an example. When racial tensions were particularly amplified here over the summer, we had a group of alum and current students set up an Instagram account, Black at BC High, where a number of our students of colour, past and present, shared their experiences. And the experience in some of the accounts were truly harrowing, right? As you can imagine. But the unwieldy nature of it became very, very difficult to manage. And it wasn't about managing it, but it was trying to engage those, you know, those people who wrote the accounts in conversations. I think that the language I like using, Leni, is that like our schools are business, but our business is schooling, right? And I think that getting that balance is very difficult. And I know we have to run schools like a business, but if we keep coming back to the fact that we are a school and our business is schooling, I think that can have a powerful recentering impact on the school. And so whether it be Instagram, Twitter, in terms of our messaging, I would hope that you look at our social media, it's pretty clear what matters to us, and it's the education formation of our boys. And I think that's what comes through. I think you can overcomplicate it. I think it can be unnecessarily complicated at times. But I think if you constantly recenter and are clear on where it's coming from, then I think that looks after itself. You know, it's never that simple. I get that, but I think it's important to do that.
Yeah, keeps it grounded. And also, I guess I saw some commonality too in that necessity to be able to pivot very quickly, which is exactly what you were describing earlier.
Yeah.
So, well, in Australia, I work closely with a number of principals, as I mentioned, and they sometimes refer to the silver linings within the whole COVID-19 experience. Have there been any silver linings that you've observed, Adam?
Oh yeah, for sure, Lenny. And I think in the last couple of months, I've actually got, I've started to see them. Before that, it was really difficult to work out what they were. But now with our boys back in the building, and in terms of preparing for them over the summer, so my mind really moved into that space. And I think the key one for me is that the pandemic has forced us, and I've used this language before, to really recenter as a school. And one of the observations I had when I arrived at BC High just over 12 months ago is that, and this is not dissimilar to Catholic schools around the globe, I don't believe, and particularly all boys Catholic schools, is that it was almost sitting on a metaphorical fence. You know, I felt as though, and I've shared this with our faculty and staff, that it seemed to be suffering from almost like an identity crisis. And, you know, enrollments had dropped over a number of years. So that forces you to look at the product, right? Or the marketing of the product. And then I feel as though there's this risk that you try to be all things to all people. Mm-hmm. And when you get into that space, the risk is you become nothing to no one. Now, I'm not saying that's where BC High is, but I felt as though I was going through that process of really trying to identify who we are. Mm-hmm. And the one thing about the pandemic, Lenny, is it's forced us into that space to really recenter, because there was this worry about enrollments dropping, and we had to be really clear on who we are. And what it did to the language you used at the beginning is it forced us into a space we had to scrap for relationships. Like we found ourselves now fighting for the very thing we hold dear. Now that's hard and it's an enormous challenge, but what it also serves to do is to say, this is what matters to us. Mm. Now, you shouldn't need a pandemic to do that, but it's one of the byproducts of it. We realized how much we value each other, how much we value our kids in the building. And so when you do that, it has this usually crystallizing impact, I think, on the school. So for us, that recentering process has been a real silver lining. And even when you talk about our enrollments, I mean, our enrollments have trended up this year. For the first time, and have certainly exceeded expectations. Now, there's a number of factors to that. We've got an outstanding enrolments team in place under the leadership of Charlie Drain, and they have been phenomenal. And we also, when we pivoted to remote, or as I say, connected learning in March, our faculty were extraordinary. So the way they did that and the way they engaged our boys, and that communication gets out. So there's a number of people who had interest in the school because of that, and because a lot of the public schools are going back remotely. So I acknowledge those things, but I also like to believe, even before COVID hit here, when we were talking to prospective parents and prospective families, we were so clear on who we are. And we were clear in saying that, you know, we're all an all boys school. We are about a whole formation. We unpack that, obviously. And we also acknowledge that for some families, that's just not what they want, or it doesn't work. And that's perfectly fine. But I think the clarity around that also was a contributing factor to the enrollments. And the pandemic really even created a higher level of awareness in my mind about who we are. And that's for me, that's a real silver lining. I mean, the other piece is, just from a purely pedagogical point of view, is that it's forced us to think creatively about how we teach and learn and how we assess. So being able to reimagine that, and we were having that conversation, but it kind of accelerated that, has been really rich. It's not always easy. And it's never easy when it's imposed on you because of a particular context that you can't control. But I think most of our teachers have gotten to a space where they realize there's great opportunity in that as well. And so, as I said, we invested 1.2 million on technology in the classrooms. Our teachers now are standing in a classroom with microphones in the roof, with the boys at home projected on the back wall, having a conversation with half the kids in class. And I was up in a science lab today, and the boys in the building are working in pairs with the boys at home, right? Now, our boys at home are as connected as the kids in the classroom. That's huge pressure on teachers. Apart from the fact they're trying to navigate the new technology, which isn't always smooth, right? They have to completely reimagine how they engage, in some cases, 13 boys at home and 12 in front of them. So that, I think that's a real silver lining, you know? I guess the other piece I'd say, Lenny, is that we have the Hyde Centre for Global Education here, which is wonderful. But I often wrestle with this concept of a global citizen. And Father Sosa, who's a Superior General of the Jesuits, put out a paper a couple of years ago, and he was challenging this idea of global and saying that, you know, perhaps more appropriate language is intercultural, right? And I actually love that language. And because we haven't been able to go on trips and do the global experiential thing, it started, I think it's got a conversation happening here about what global actually means. And this year we're going to spend some time incorporating it more in the curriculum, but also thinking about what it means to be truly intercultural. And if you marry that with some of the experiences of our students of colour and how this has brought that conversation to the surface, there is opportunity all through that, you know, not easy opportunity, but wonderful, wonderful context for it to happen. So they're the things I would think of immediately. I'm sure there are others.
That's wonderful. As I say, it's become a bit hackneyed now, but never waste a crisis.
Yeah, that's right. And I think I'm in that space now. It took me a while to get there because we were dealing with what is right in front of us. But we don't, you know, as a leader, we don't have that luxury just to deal with what's right in front of us, you know. And that's good.
Yeah, and it's interesting that a lot of what you're saying aligns with a lot of the experience of many schools here in Australia. I've heard principals say we've actually had 5 years worth of professional growth in teachers.
Yeah.
And people at principal level are speaking with such pride and gratitude for the work that their teachers are doing. They're just putting their hands to the wheel.
Yeah. That's been my experience as well, Lenny. I mean, I'm so proud and extraordinarily grateful to our teachers, as you imagine. And also, just as I said before, it's not easy, especially here in Massachusetts, because we're asking our teachers to come in here every day. In many cases, we had teachers who weren't able to come in this year, who had to take a year of unpaid leave for the year, you know, and even navigating that over the summer because they weren't able to manage childcare or their context at home didn't enable to do that. And we've got teachers in here. I'm very aware of the weight they're carrying every morning they come in here, you know, so we need to support them and in every way we can.
Exactly. So when this pandemic is over, and it will eventually be over, what do you think will be the strongest memories that you'll take away from it, Adam? What that will stay with you always?
The collectivity of our community here. That has been a very powerful experience for me. I don't think I'll ever forget the selflessness of so many in our community. And it's all well and good to say that you work in a place that's committed to mission, but to see that in reality is really inspiring. So I think that the way that people have come together here, and even despite own apprehensions and trepidation, have still stepped up for something greater. And I don't want to be too hyperbolic about that, but that's just the reality of what's happened. You know, I think I'll always carry that with me. As I've said, I think the way it has clarified our mission as a school, but also as a leader in Jesuit schools, the way it's crystallized that for me, it's kind of a real acid test. But the clarity that's given me in terms of me feeling in the right place at a personal level, that's something that I'll take away as well. And I think that, something I referred to earlier, that feeling of having to find the courage to be honest, to reflect honestly and critically, even when it's really uncomfortable, how hard I found that, how surprising it was for me for the level of courage to do that. I think they're the things that will sit with me. I mean, they're more emotional things and feelings, but I think they're the things that do reside with you for a period of time, right? I mean, I think over time I'll probably forget some of the practical things around it, but I don't imagine that I will forget how I felt through the relationships I shared during this time, and the way that people drew strength from each other.
How would you see that it will affect your leadership, having been through this rather crucible-like experience?
I think it'll make me more reflective. Stoic can sometimes have a negative connotation, but I think it's made me more stoic. It's made me, I think I have a greater capacity to deal with emotions. And I think you find that, I don't know if you found this, Lenny, I'm sure you did, but as I said, because schools are emotional places, there's a range of emotions you experience in any given day. You can come up, from the high of having a wonderful conversation with a student in the Commons to navigating a really, really difficult issue between faculty members, for example, whatever it may be. And my capacity to suspend the emotion while still being aware of it, if that makes sense, because I have to do that to actually lead. I've always known the importance of it, but I've had to do that so much. And that's been a really, really key learning for me. Does that make sense?
It does a lot. Yeah. I would imagine you'll be drawing on that. That will become part of your DNA, I guess.
Yeah, I think so.
When you will have lived through it through the full cycle. So what advice would you give to, I'm just thinking now of people who might be in their very first year of principalship. Any advice you'd give to them?
Come back to who you are. I think that, for me, the learning has been, we're a place based on relationships. So prioritize those, work hard at them, draw strength from them, but be unshakable in terms of who you are. And for me, that's coming back to your heart. And when I say heart in our place, it's our mission and our students. And if you keep coming back to that, I think while the road could be rocky, you're going to end at the right place. And so being clear on that when there's opportunities to actually deviate from it, I find, as I said, I think during the pandemic, I think we could have taken easy options, which would have been more convenient, but they wouldn't have been true to who we are. So to remain constantly centered on who we are, that's the only advice I give. I mean, it's not particularly profound, Lenny, but it's what I've learned. And it's what sustained me, and I hope what has sustained and will continue to sustain our community, at least.
Thank you. I'm conscious that there will be people that are tuning in today, perhaps looking afterwards at the recorded webinar, and they will be in very different physical contexts right across America, in small places, in places that are doing great battle with the pandemic at the moment, in big cities, and the same in Australia, of people who might work in quite remote places in Australia, and sometimes with a very wide mix of different sorts of needs in highly Indigenous communities or multicultural migrant-based communities. What message of hope could you give to school leaders and teachers and communities across that vast array, not just here in the US or for you in the US or here in Australia, but across the world?
Yeah, so the message of hope. Geez, Lenny. The first thing is...
No pressure, Adam, no pressure.
No, but I mean, be comfortable to reimagine what it looks like. So we always say meet the students where they're at. Where they're at is a place that's foreign to any of us, right? But the hope is that the great hope I get is seeing how our boys have adapted. Like, they've been extraordinary. And I think sometimes it's hard. Well, I know for the adults, it's harder. But as I said, the great hope for me is that in our case, our boys want to learn. They want to be engaged. They want to be connected. That's what I've learned. And there's great hope for me that's generated in that. You know, if they didn't feel that, that would be difficult, right? Because what it also shows is that what we hold dear is what they hold dear. And they don't always articulate it as young people, but they've been forced into a space where they have to articulate it. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, that's inspiring and gives me great hope. So, as I said, students at the center of it, but also understanding that they're open to the change, they are adaptable, and they will ultimately work with you. You know, like they want to be in school, or they want to be part of a community. You know, and our boys aren't, as I said, traditionally boys, in my experience, aren't that open about that. But even in the last week, you know, they have said that openly. You know, either in person. You know, I spoke to our year 11s last week, and at the beginning of the year, welcomed them back and said to them, look, this is their school, and every time they come in, they have the responsibility to shape it, and we want to take that seriously. And you know, when I walked out of there, I think I've had close to 20 conversations since I walked out that door. And it's boys setting up Zoom meetings when they're at home, or setting up appointments, coming to the office, and they're talking about how they want their school to be better. Yeah. You know, and that that gives me great hope.
Yeah, that's a wonderful message to end on. So I'm thinking, Adam, listening to you overall has been such a profound experience. It's a privilege to work with you this afternoon. I'm sure other people are feeling the same thing. And I'm conscious that across America and Australia, there are thousands of school principals who are valiantly keeping their communities connected. They're caring for and supporting their people, as you've described, while juggling complexities and uncertainties on just so many levels. It's sort of like VUCA on steroids, I think, at the moment. Yeah. And there are hundreds of thousands of teachers who love their students, caring for and teaching them, and who are now returning to school, and sometimes with trepidation for the reasons that you mentioned. So, Adam, you've given us all a better understanding of the work of schools and the challenges of those who work in them. Thank you so much. It's been a great...
No, thank you for the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you. Look, I just want to thank both Adam and Leonie for tonight's discussion. You know, particularly in the US, so much of the current conversation around school openings can be highly emotional as communities seek to balance the often competing interests of teachers and students and parents. So in that context, I really just want to thank Adam and Leonie for an informed and honest and unpretentious discussion of these issues, and importantly for putting COVID in the context of needing to understand why your school exists, the importance of engaging with the students, and the importance of supporting their relationships with each other. Look, this pandemic is new ground for everybody, whether you're in schools, workplaces, and communities, and there's no instruction book that helps us all navigate these issues. But I do think that through honest discussions like we've had this evening, hopefully we'll develop some best practices that will help us handle similar crises in the future. And I know that everyone watching this webinar is very grateful to the two of you for this discussion. So thank you. Thanks. And thanks also to everyone who's watching or listening to the webinar. The webinar is recorded and will be available for replay on the association's website in the next 24 hours. I hope that you can join us later this week on Thursday night in the US, Friday morning in Australia, for the webinar discussing Australia's participation with the US in the mission to return to the moon and then on to Mars. And details of that are on the AAA website. So thanks again to all of you. Thanks for joining us tonight, and please stay safe and healthy. Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.